Jamal and Keisha, two young black twins, had never been to court before. Their hearts were racing as they entered the courtroom, which was much bigger and more intimidating than they had imagined. The walls were lined with dark wood, the benches were filled with serious-looking people, and there was an air of tension that filled the room. The twins walked in together, side by side, trying to stay calm despite the nervousness bubbling inside them. It wasn't a criminal case, but the weight of the situation felt like it was much bigger. They had been summoned to this small local courthouse for a minor legal matter. The case wasn't something that should have caused them any trouble, but for some reason, they felt like they were about to be judged more harshly than anyone else in the room. It wasn't just the courtroom that felt intimidating, but also the judge who was known for being strict and harsh. The twins had heard stories about Judge Thompson, a man who didn't tolerate nonsense, but also one who didn't always seem fair in his decisions. They had no idea what to expect, but hoped they would get through the day without much trouble. As they walked to their seats, Jamal looked at Keisha, giving her a slight reassuring smile. She returned the gesture, but both of them knew that this moment would stay with them for a long time, no matter what happened. They had always been close, and now more than ever, they needed to stay united. Their lawyer had told them to stay calm and let her do the talking, but the reality of being in court made the nerves even harder to manage. Keisha felt the weight of the room on her shoulders as she sat down beside her twin. The judge finally entered the room. Judge Thompson was tall, with a deep voice that immediately commanded attention. He didn't smile as he walked to the front, taking his place at the bench. He glanced at everyone in the room with a look that seemed both cold and impatient. The twins, sitting quietly in their seats, couldn't help but notice how the judge barely even looked at them as he began to speak. It was as if they were just another case to him, another number, not people with their own stories. "Let's get this over with," the judge muttered under his breath as he glanced down at the paperwork in front of him. He barely acknowledged the twins and instead began speaking to their lawyer, his voice harsh and dismissive. The twins exchanged worried glances, but they knew they had to stay quiet. The judge's words were sharp, his tone not at all comforting, and they immediately felt like they were being judged for more than just the case at hand. Despite everything, the twins tried to remain calm, focusing on their lawyer's reassuring presence. But as the judge continued, his remarks became more pointed and critical. Jamal and Keisha exchanged nervous looks, feeling like they were under a microscope. The way the judge spoke, they couldn't help but feel singled out. His attitude made it clear that he wasn't interested in hearing anything about their side of the story. All they had hoped for was a fair chance to explain their situation, but it was beginning to feel like the judge wasn't even listening to them. As the minutes dragged on, the atmosphere in the courtroom became heavier. The twins had no idea what to expect next, but one thing was clear: this wasn't going to be an easy day. Judge Thompson finally spoke, his voice echoing in the quiet courtroom as he glanced at the twins. He didn't make eye contact with them, but rather looked over his paperwork, his eyes scanning the documents without any real focus. "All right, what do we have here?" he said in a tone that was more impatient than curious, clearly uninterested in the details of the case. The twins felt their hearts skip a beat. They weren't sure why the judge was being so dismissive, but it only made their nerves worse. Jamal shifted in his seat, trying to stay calm. He looked over at Keisha, who was gripping her purse tightly in her lap, her fingers turning white from the tension. Neither of them had expected the judge to be so cold right from the start. They had hoped for a fair hearing, a chance to explain their side, but it seemed like that wouldn't be happening anytime soon. As their lawyer started speaking, explaining the basics of their case, the judge barely listened. His eyes were constantly scanning the room, as if he couldn't be bothered with the details. He interrupted their lawyer several times, cutting her off with comments that didn't seem to address the matter at hand. Jamal felt the frustration build up inside him. It was like the judge didn't even care enough to give them the attention they deserved. It was becoming clear that they were being treated differently just because of who they were. The judge finally turned his gaze toward the twins, almost as if he was just remembering they were there. "I don't know why you people even bother with these things," he muttered under his breath, making sure the twins could hear every word. It wasn't a question directed at them, but the way he said it made Jamal feel as if he was somehow less than human. Keisha, who had always been the more outspoken one, clenched her fists. She could feel her anger rising, but she didn't say anything. She knew it wouldn't help. The judge's dismissive attitude wasn't just frustrating, it felt hurtful. His words stung, and it was hard to ignore the fact that they were being treated as if their case wasn't important. It wasn't the first time they had felt the weight of prejudice, but in that moment it seemed so much more intense. Why was he being so harsh? What had they done to deserve this treatment? Judge Thompson continued speaking, but his comments were becoming more critical, more personal. He didn't even seem to acknowledge that the twins were people with their own lives, their own stories. Instead, he reduced them to nothing more than an inconvenience in his busy day. "You'll figure it out," he said flippantly, barely looking at them. Kesha's eyes began to fill with frustration. She knew she had to keep quiet, but the unfairness of it all was overwhelming. Jamal could feel her tension. He wished there was something they could do, something to make the judge see them as more than just strangers in his courtroom. They were people, and they deserved to be treated with respect, no matter what brought them here today. But at that moment, it seemed like the judge was determined to see them as less than that. The tension in the courtroom continued to build as Judge Thompson's words grew sharper. Jamal and Keisha sat in stunned silence, barely able to believe what they were hearing. The judge didn't seem interested in the details of their case, nor did he show any empathy. Instead, he made constant comments that only seemed to reinforce his opinion of them. Every time he spoke, it felt like another blow to their confidence. As the judge glanced at their case file, he muttered under his breath, "This is exactly what I expected from people like you." His tone was dismissive, and his words hung in the air like a cloud of judgment. Jamal's hands were sweating, and he could feel his heart racing. How could someone who didn't even know them be so cruel? Kesha, sitting beside him, stiffened in her seat. She wanted to speak up, to tell him off, but she knew better than to risk making things worse. The judge wasn't finished. "People like you think you can just walk in here and have things handed to you," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Jamal could feel the heat rising in his cheeks. He clenched his jaw, trying to hold back the anger that threatened to spill over. He and Keisha had worked hard their whole lives. They had never been handed anything. They had earned everything they had. And yet here was a man who didn't even know them, belittling them in front of everyone. The twins exchanged a brief glance. Keisha's eyes were wide, filled with hurt and disbelief. She couldn't understand why the judge was being so harsh. They had come here with every intention of resolving their case fairly, but instead, they were being treated like they didn't matter. The more the judge spoke, the more it felt like he was judging them based on their appearance, their race, or something else entirely. It wasn't about their case anymore. It was about his bias. Jamal's thoughts raced. He wanted to say something, to stand up for both himself and his sister. But he knew that speaking out would likely only make the situation worse. He took a deep breath and focused on his sister's calm demeanor, trying to stay composed for her. He couldn't let the judge see how badly his words had cut him. Keisha had always been the stronger one when it came to standing her ground, but even she seemed lost in this moment. Finally, their lawyer stepped in, her voice steady as she tried to steer the case back on track. "Your Honor, I must ask that you show the twins the same respect you would show any other citizens who are in this courtroom. They deserve to be treated fairly, just as anyone else would," she said, her words polite but firm. Judge Thompson looked at her with a raised eyebrow, as though he didn't understand why she was even bothering. "Fairly, I'm giving them a chance to speak." "Isn't that enough?" he replied, his voice growing louder. The more he spoke, the more it became clear that he didn't see the twins as equal to anyone else in the room. It was as though their worth was being decided based on his own prejudices, not the facts of the case. The twins remained silent, each of them stewing in their own mix of confusion and frustration. They had hoped for a neutral, unbiased judge who would listen to them, but it was clear now that they were up against something much more personal. They didn't know what to do next, but they couldn't help but feel that this encounter was about so much more than just a legal matter. It was about the way they were being seen in the world, and the harsh reality that not everyone was willing to treat them with the respect they deserved. As the proceedings dragged on, the twins began to feel the weight of the situation more heavily. They tried their best to focus on the case at hand, but it was hard to ignore the judge's continuing remarks, which only seemed to grow more judgmental. The more they tried to stay composed, the more the pressure seemed to build. Keisha's nerves were fraying, and Jamal could feel his own anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Neither of them could understand why the judge was being so hard on them, especially when they had done nothing wrong. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just about the case. It was about something far more personal, something they didn't understand. The twins had grown up in a tough neighborhood, but they had never let it define them. Their father, Marcus Cole, had worked tirelessly to provide for them, making sure they had opportunities to succeed. He had always told them that they could rise above any challenge, no matter where they came from. Jamal and Keisha took those words to heart, and they had done everything they could to build lives for themselves that would make their father proud. They had gone to school, worked hard, and stayed out of trouble. They were doing everything right, yet here they were, sitting in a courtroom, being treated as though they were inferior. What the judge didn't know, however, was that Marcus Cole was not just any ordinary man. He was a successful and influential businessman, well known in the city for his achievements and his connections. But more importantly, he was a man of integrity who had earned the respect of everyone who knew him. What the judge also didn't know was that Marcus was, in fact, his boss. Marcus had given Judge Thompson his position in the courtroom, and their paths had crossed on several occasions in the past. But none of this was known to the judge at this moment. The twins had not mentioned their father's identity, not wanting to rely on his influence or connections to get through their case. They believed that they could handle it on their own, that they could prove they were just as capable as anyone else, no matter who their father was. However, as the judge continued to belittle them, they began to feel like that decision was a mistake. Maybe it would have been better to mention their father's name, to let the judge know who they were related to. But by now, the damage had already been done. The judge's bias was too evident to ignore, and it seemed like he was determined to make them feel small and insignificant. In the midst of all this, Kesha's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out discreetly, trying not to draw attention. It was a text from their father. "Stay calm. I'm handling it," it read. That simple message brought a sense of relief to Kesha. She looked at Jamal, who had seen her reading the text. Without saying a word, they both knew what it meant. Their father had likely heard about the situation and was already doing something about it. Despite the tension, a small sense of comfort began to settle over the twins. They had been raised by a man who had always been there for them, who had always protected them, and it seemed like this would be no different. As the case continued, they tried to focus on the facts, knowing that their father's presence would soon be felt in the courtroom, whether the judge realized it or not. They didn't have to fight this battle alone. But for now, they would remain silent and let the proceedings unfold. As the case continued, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Jamal and Keisha could feel the judge's cold gaze on them, but they kept their heads held high. The more the judge spoke, the more obvious it became that he was treating them unfairly. His comments were getting sharper, more personal, and it seemed like nothing could make him reconsider his approach. Despite the growing frustration, the twins stayed silent, determined not to let the situation escalate any further. But deep inside, Jamal and Keisha both felt a mixture of disbelief and anger. How could someone who didn't even know them treat them like this? They had been raised with values of respect and hard work, and yet they were being dismissed as if they were worthless. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about how the judge was seeing them, how he was judging them based on nothing more than his own assumptions. As their lawyer spoke, trying her best to explain the situation and keep things moving forward, Jamal could tell that the judge wasn't listening. He wasn't even pretending to pay attention. Instead, his eyes flicked around the room, his fingers tapping impatiently on the desk. His disinterest was so clear that it was almost painful to watch. Jamal could feel the frustration building in his chest, but he kept his composure. He wanted to speak up, to defend himself and his sister, but he knew that arguing with the judge wouldn't help. Then, just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, the unexpected happened. The courtroom doors opened quietly, and in walked a tall figure, Marcus Cole, the twins' father. Jamal and Keisha barely recognized him at first, not because they didn't know him, but because he didn't look anything like the man they knew. He was calm, controlled, and his presence seemed to fill the room the moment he stepped inside. It wasn't just his height or the way he carried himself, it was the quiet confidence he exuded. As Marcus made his way toward the front of the courtroom, the judge stopped mid-sentence. He had been speaking, but the sudden shift in the atmosphere was enough to make him falter. For a brief moment, there was silence, and then the judge's expression changed. He wasn't just surprised, he looked downright unsettled. Jamal and Keisha exchanged a quick glance. They hadn't expected their father to show up so suddenly, but it was clear that he had something to do with what was happening now. Marcus looked directly at the judge, his eyes cold but polite. There was no sign of anger or frustration, just a quiet determination that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice steady and calm. "I believe we've had a misunderstanding." The judge's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated. It was as if he suddenly realized who Marcus was, or more accurately, who Marcus's family was. He had seen this man before, in business meetings, in social settings, but never had he imagined that Marcus Cole, one of the most powerful men in the city, could be connected to the very people he had just insulted so freely. The twins watched in silence as their father's presence seemed to change the entire atmosphere in the room. The judge, who had been so quick to dismiss them, now seemed unsure of himself. Marcus's words were measured and deliberate, and it was clear that whatever had been happening in the courtroom just moments before was about to take a turn. Jamal and Keisha exchanged a quiet sigh of relief. They had been nervous about what might happen, but now, with their father there, things were shifting. The sense of unfairness that had been hanging over them suddenly began to feel like it could be corrected. Marcus's simple but powerful presence had changed everything. It was clear that the judge had not anticipated this, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that Marcus Cole's influence could alter the course of the day. The courtroom was silent for a long moment after Marcus Cole entered. The change in atmosphere was immediate, and Jamal and Keisha could feel the shift as soon as their father spoke. The tension that had been so thick only moments before began to lift, replaced by a sense of uncertainty from the judge. The room had gone from uncomfortable to quiet, almost as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Marcus's voice cut through the stillness. His words were calm, measured, and steady, but there was an underlying authority that made everyone in the room pay attention. "Your Honor," Marcus began, his tone neutral but firm, "I believe we've had a misunderstanding." The judge blinked, taken aback by the unexpected arrival of someone so influential. For a brief moment, he seemed uncertain, as if trying to process who exactly was standing in front of him. Then it hit him. Marcus Cole, the very man who had helped shape the city's business landscape, the one whose decisions had impacted everything from local laws to city planning. Marcus wasn't just a businessman. He was a force in the community. The judge's face shifted from confusion to realization, and a deep flush crept up his neck. The twins watched quietly, unsure of what would happen next. They had never intended to bring their father into the situation. They had hoped that their case would stand on its own merit, without needing to rely on Marcus's position or influence. But now, seeing their father in the courtroom, the tension they had been holding on to began to fade. They weren't sure what to expect, but they had a feeling that the judge was about to realize that he had made a serious mistake. Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "I understand that you may have some preconceived notions about my children, but let me assure you, they are just as deserving of respect as anyone else in this courtroom." His words were simple, but there was a weight to them that made the judge shift uncomfortably in his seat. "It's important that you treat every person who steps into this room with dignity, regardless of their background." The judge, clearly flustered, opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, and he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Marcus had put him on the defensive, and the judge wasn't used to being called out in such a direct manner. I apologize," the judge stammered, his usual confident tone now gone. His face was flushed, and he was clearly uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't. I didn't realize who you were." Marcus didn't let the apology linger. He was not one to entertain empty gestures. "I would suggest that you carefully consider the way you treat the people in this courtroom," he said firmly. "The integrity of the justice system depends on fairness and respect, not on personal biases." Jamal and Keisha exchanged a look. They had expected their father to step in, but they hadn't expected him to handle the situation with such calm precision. They had always admired his ability to stay composed, no matter the circumstances. It was clear that Marcus wasn't just a successful businessman. He was a man of principle, and that was something the judge had failed to recognize. The judge, now visibly flustered, cleared his throat and looked down at the paperwork in front of him. "I'll make sure to be more considerate going forward," he said, the words feeling strained as he tried to regain his composure. It was evident that he was trying to save face, but it was also clear that the damage had already been done. Marcus nodded slightly, his expression still calm but unyielding. "I trust you'll do the right thing," he said, before turning to face his children. His gaze softened as he looked at Jamal and Keisha, and for the first time that day, the twins felt a sense of relief wash over them. They had feared the worst when they entered the courtroom, unsure of how the judge would treat them. But now, with their father's influence at work, they knew they weren't just going to be another case to be brushed aside. They were people, worthy of respect. And thanks to Marcus, it seemed like they were finally going to get it. As the proceedings resumed, there was a noticeable shift in the judge's demeanor. He no longer spoke with the same condescending tone, and his words were more measured. The judgment that had been clouding the courtroom seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of professionalism that had been sorely lacking before. Marcus's presence had made all the difference, and it was clear that the judge understood the consequences of his earlier behavior. For Jamal and Keisha, the situation wasn't over yet, but it was no longer as intimidating as it had been. They felt a renewed sense of confidence, knowing that their father's support was. After the tense exchange in the courtroom, Jamal and Keisha could feel a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The weight that had been pressing down on them seemed to lighten, though the situation was far from resolved. Their father, Marcus Cole, had taken control of the room, but they both knew that this moment of intervention wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of what would likely be a very different outcome. Marcus had always been the kind of person who dealt with things head-on. He didn't shy away from confrontation, but he didn't handle it with anger. Instead, he approached everything with calm resolve. Jamal and Keisha admired this about him, though sometimes they found it intimidating. But today, seeing their father stand up to the judge had made them feel both protected and proud. He wasn't just defending them. He was showing them the importance of standing up for what was right, regardless of the consequences. As the judge fumbled over his apology, trying to backtrack from his earlier behavior, the twins couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. They had been humiliated in front of everyone, and yet there was a sense of satisfaction, knowing that the judge now understood the consequences of his actions. The power dynamics in the room had completely shifted, but it didn't erase the sting of what had happened. Jamal and Keisha were both relieved that their father had intervened, but they also felt disappointed that it had to come to this in the first place. Why should they have to rely on someone else to be treated with respect? Despite the judge's attempt to backpedal, Marcus didn't let him off easily. "Your apology doesn't erase what happened," Marcus said calmly, his eyes steady on the judge. "But it's a start. Just remember, respect isn't something that can be granted or taken away. It's earned. I hope you'll take this lesson to heart." The judge nodded, his face still red from the discomfort of being called out in such a direct manner. He tried to gather his thoughts, but knew that the damage had already been done. He had made a mistake, and no amount of apology could truly fix it. He had let his biases show, and now he had to reckon with the consequences. For the twins, though, it was becoming clear that their father's intervention had changed everything. As the judge continued to try to regain his composure, Marcus turned to Jamal and Keisha, his gaze softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Jamal nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a little shaken. "We're fine, Dad," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. It was just a lot to take in. Kesha, who had been quiet for most of the proceedings, spoke up. "I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't expect him to treat us like that," she admitted, her voice still carrying the weight of what had happened. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder, offering her a reassuring smile. "I know, sweetie, but sometimes people act out of ignorance, and when that happens, we have to remind them of what's right. What's important is that you didn't let him get to you. You handled this with strength." The twins took a deep breath, the tension in their shoulders starting to ease. They knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but they felt a new sense of confidence knowing that their father had their back. They also understood something deeper, that sometimes standing up for yourself meant relying on others, but it was just as important to have the strength to handle things on your own when needed. As the proceedings continued, the judge seemed more reserved, carefully choosing his words as he finally began to review the case with the seriousness it deserved. He no longer dismissed the twins as if they were beneath him. It was clear that Marcus's presence had not only affected the judge's behavior, but had also reminded everyone in the room of the value of fairness and respect. Jamal and Keisha sat quietly, their heads held a little higher now. They weren't just waiting for the case to be resolved. They were learning from it. The experience had shown them that while they could face unfair situations, they didn't have to let those situations define them. With their father's support, they knew they had the strength to face whatever challenges came their way. It wasn't about the judge's apology anymore. It was about the lessons they would carry forward in life. Though the road to a final decision was still ahead, the twins felt a sense of hope that had been missing earlier. Whatever came next, they knew they had each other, and they knew they were never alone in the fight for respect. As the case finally came to a close, Jamal and Keisha sat in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. The courtroom, once filled with tension, was now almost calm. The judge, though still visibly uncomfortable, had shifted his approach and treated them with a newfound respect. Marcus had done what he came to do. He had stepped in, spoken his mind, and shown the judge the importance of fairness and dignity. But for Jamal and Keisha, the experience was far from over. They were left to process everything that had happened, and the emotions were still raw. As the proceedings ended, the twins felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. On one hand, they were glad that the situation had been handled, that their father's intervention had set things right. They no longer had to worry about the judge's dismissive remarks or feeling like they were less than anyone else in the courtroom. But on the other hand, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had been taken from them that day. The judge's initial treatment had left a mark, one that wouldn't be easy to forget. It wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about how they were seen and treated in the world. When they left the courtroom, their father walked with them, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. He didn't need to say much to comfort them. They knew he had their backs, no matter what. As they stepped out into the bright sunlight, The world outside felt a little different. The weight of the courtroom had lifted, but there was still a heaviness in the air. Jamal spoke first, breaking the silence. "Dad, thanks for stepping in. I don't know what we would have done without you." Marcus gave him a soft smile. "You didn't need me, son. You did just fine on your own. You both handled that situation with grace and strength." Kesha looked at her father, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I know, but I don't think we could have handled the judge alone. It was like he didn't even see us. It felt like we were invisible." Marcus's expression softened, and he nodded. "I understand. People can be blind to what's right in front of them sometimes, but you don't let that define who you are. You don't let their ignorance dictate your worth." The twins nodded, feeling a little lighter now. They knew their father was right. They had been through something difficult, but it hadn't been about the case. It had been about how they were treated, how someone had assumed things about them based on nothing more than prejudice. They realized, though, that the experience didn't have to break them. It could teach them something. "It's just frustrating, though," Kesha said, her voice still carrying the weight of what had happened. "Why do people still think that way? Why is it so hard for some to just see us for who we are?" Marcus paused, considering her words carefully. "Because people are shaped by their own experiences, Kesha. Not everyone sees the world through the same lens, but that doesn't mean you have to change who you are to fit their narrow view. What matters is how you carry yourself. You have to rise above it." Jamal and Kesha exchanged glances, feeling a sense of clarity wash over them. It wasn't about changing themselves or proving anyone wrong. It was about staying true to who they were, no matter how others saw them. They realized that while they couldn't control how people treated them, they could control how they responded. And that was where their true power lay. As they made their way back to the car, they felt a sense of closure. The judge had apologized, but the lesson they had learned went beyond that. They had been treated unfairly, yes, but they hadn't let it define them. They had held their heads high, knowing their worth, and their father had shown them the importance of standing up for themselves, even when it was difficult. The drive home was quiet, but there was a peacefulness in the air. The day had been long, and the twins were exhausted, but they knew that this experience would stay with them. It had been a lesson in resilience, in the importance of respect, and in how to handle the unexpected. Most importantly, they had learned that no matter what obstacles they faced, they would face them together, with their heads held high. That night, as they sat at the dinner table, Marcus looked at his children and smiled. "I'm proud of you both. You've shown me today that you understand what it means to stand tall, even when it's hard." Jamal and Kesha smiled back, feeling a sense of pride that went beyond the court case. They had made it through something difficult, and they had done it with strength and dignity. They didn't need the approval of anyone else. They knew their worth, and that was enough. And with that, the memory of the courtroom incident began to fade, replaced by the understanding that they were more than the sum of others' judgments. They were who they were, and that was all that mattered.